Hi, this is Hannu TheHande Mäkinen. Welcome to part 2 of the stylistic changes in US cartoons during the 20th century. In the previous part, I went through roughly the history of American animation and its major changes and turns throughout the decades. And I also highlighted what were the major stylistic changes in the various eras. And in this video, I'll be looking at 5 of the different eras and highlighting what I think are my personal favorite cartoons from each of these eras. So if you didn't see part 1, just as a refresher, the way that I divided the eras of animation during the 20th century in American animation was anything before 1937 as the black and white era, the late 30s and early 40s as the bucolic era. The first of my favorite eras is the years roughly between 1945 and 55, which is the Zany Era, the late 50s and the early 60s, which was the colored animals era, the late 60s and the entirety of the 70s, which was the clones and trend writing era, or the Scooby Doo era, the 80s, which was the high production era, and ending with the gross out era of the 1990s. Now, of the pre-1945 eras, I really don't have a lot to say. I mean, I'm a big fan of Tom and Jerry, but those very early Tom and Jerry cartoons are kind of tough for me to watch because the main characters look so goddamn weird. In fact, the few cartoons from this era that I would even personally consider worth watching are some of the middle and late era Popeye cartoons from Fleischer, but I think the post-Fleischer era Popeye is really more my speed. Now, in the Zany era of cartoons, the obvious topic for me is the Looney Tunes cast from the Warner Brothers cartoons as well as the MGM tunes. My absolute top favorite, obviously, from this era are the Tom and Jerry cartoons by MGM. These really do exemplify the Zany era at its zaniest and most extreme. I mean, these cartoons basically don't have any dialogue whatsoever, except very occasionally, and are about 2 cute cartoon characters just trying to kill each other in various creative ways. The lush animation is really what makes these cartoons so enjoyable to still watch. I mean, it's quite astonishing to consider the level of detail that they were able to put into these tunes at this very early stage. And there are just a lot of great physical gags that I remember very fondly. Now, unfortunately, the Tom and Jerry cartoons' overall animation quality really started to taper off in the latter part of the 50s, which I don't want to shit on too much because Chuck Jones still had a big role in doing these, and I am actually a huge fan of Chuck Jones's work during the 60s as well. Now, of the Warner Brothers set of characters, my obvious favorites are Bugs and Daffy, and especially once Bugs and Daffy started to appear together in cartoons. They're a bit of an interesting outlier because they're some of the few characters around this time that actually developed very distinct personalities very early on. Tunes around the Zany era didn't really focus too much on characters or character development. There was usually a very simple premise and then a lot of zany gags that were built around it, whereas there was a lot more focus on creating characters with full personalities during the colored animal era. Now, one character who kind of straddles the line between the Zany and the bucolic era, and one of the few examples where I think the slightly gross look of the bucolic era actually worked, are the droopy cartoons from Tex Avery. They are still legitimately, I think, some of the funniest cartoons ever made, because obviously Avery was very instrumental in popularizing the whole breakneck pace of the cartoons from this era, but also because Avery didn't shy away from even doing fairly risque jokes from time to time. And let's face it, Droopy isn't the prettiest character around anyway, so in a weird way, his aesthetic really fits well both into the pre-Zany and the Zany era proper. Now, I already mentioned a few of my favorites in the part 1 of the colored animal era, but I generally kind of like the assortment of animal characters that Hanna-Barbera created. Yogi Bear is the obvious king of the colored animals. I mean, Yogi's basically gone on to have a multitude of movie and spin-off series made of him in the following decades. And in fact, Yogi Bear's popularity so overshadows the rest of the colored animals canon that, in fact, most of them would end up only appearing later on as support characters in Yogi's cartoons or in some other Hanna-Barbera shows. But I've also always had a soft spot for the Flintstones. I think the character dynamics in this are what make it so great, and which is why Flintstones has also been able to come back in multiple times. Now, some of the Flintstones spin-offs were a bit frivolous. Like I pointed out, in the 70s particularly, Hanna-Barbera was really running into trouble not being able to do anything super exciting, which is why they kind of started pulling their old favorites out of the hat and just giving them a new coat of paint. But another colored animal show that I think has been kind of unfortunately forgotten a little bit is Top Cat. Top Cat had a great smart alecky crew of characters, and I always just liked this kind of a lovable scamp setup that they had going on. It always shocked me how Top Cat had such a short time under the sun. Whereas with Flintstones, not only have there been a bunch of different spin-offs, the show itself has been the inspiration of a lot of copycat shows. Hanna-Barbera's own The Jetsons, and The Simpsons basically kind of started off as a parody of the Flintstones. I mean, have you ever wondered where Barney got his name? Now, I don't have as many absolute favorites from the cartoons of the 60s and 70s, and even though I kind of shat on this generation for basically just being a bunch of Scooby Doo clones as well as just some absolutely shameless trend-writing tunes, one that immediately pops to mind is the weird Godzilla cartoon that Hanna-Barbera made. I do actually have a soft spot for Scooby Doo, and I personally do like most of the spin-off shows that have come out over the years. Scooby Doo is basically the most consistently popular character from this particular era. But I do want to highlight one trend-writing cartoon, which is actually part of this kind of a morbid phenomenon that happened in the mid to late 70s. Hong Kong Phooey is a show about a dog janitor working at a police station who has a double identity as a superhero who is supposedly a master of kung fu, the titular Hong Kong Phooey. However, Phooey is a completely incompetent superhero who only ever succeeds thanks to dumb luck and thanks to the help of his much more intelligent cat. And he also has a transforming car. Now that I come to think of it, Hong Kong Phooey is basically just a prototype Inspector Gadget. Now, I happen to love this cartoon partly because of the great performance by Scatman Crothers, who played Phooey, and because of all the cartoony gags that took place in the show. But I cannot mention Hong Kong Phooey without obviously mentioning Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee was a Chinese-American martial artist and film actor who became very popular in the early part of the 70s, thanks to starring in 4 back-to-back very successful films, which kind of kicked off this whole martial arts and kung fu trend of the early 70s, leading to stuff like the song Kung Fu Fighting. But Lee then tragically died in the mid-70s quite unexpectedly, which in turn then led to this really morbid and even disgusting thing called Bruceploitation, both in the US and in Hong Kong, where Bruce Lee made most of his movies. Basically, Hong Kong film studios started to look for the next Bruce Lee and would hire just any old schmuck who even looked remotely like him and tried to make films similar to the ones that he had made, which resulted in a lot of really low-quality Hong Kong cinema around that time. But the US was not much better, and Hong Kong Phooey is very obviously just riding on the coattails of this particular trend. But like I said, I do actually kind of like this show because of how of its age it really is. Now, the 1980s high production era resulted in a lot of iconic cartoons, and some which had very tragically short lives, like Bionic 6, but also some shows that were just weirdly popular, like the Care Bears. And at the very tail end of the 80s, we also had the emergence of the kid cartoons with stuff like Yo Yogi and a pup named Scooby Doo. Now, my favorite cartoon of the 80s is also my favorite cartoon of all time, which is He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, but I already have quite a few videos talking about that one, so I won't waste too much of your time. I will highlight that after Mattel rather abruptly ended their partnership with Filmation in the middle of She-Ra's second season, Filmation did unsuccessfully try to recapture some of that thunder by launching another cartoon series based on an action figure line, which became Brave Star, which unfortunately then bombed. Now, Dick Entertainment produced some of my favorite cartoons based on video games during the late 1980s, such as Captain N the Game Master, the Super Mario Bros. Super Show, which also featured the Zelda cartoons. But I think my favorite cartoon from Dick during the 1980s was actually something called Heathcliff and the Cadillac Cats. This was the second time that Heathcliff had been adapted into animation. The previous effort was done by Hanna-Barbera, but Dick's Heathcliff is just so much better of a cartoon, not just because of the lush cartoony look, but also because of the soundtrack by Shuki Levi, who, by the way, became famous because of He-Man. But I will admit that I'm maybe a bigger fan of actually the Cadillac Cat segments of these cartoons, which started Riff Raff and his support cast of weird cat characters. Now, they're nothing like super special, but the high animation quality and the great characterizations is really what sets them apart, especially compared to the Heathcliff segments. And there is definitely a little bit of an overlap here with Top Cat, which is also at least partly the reason why I love watching these shows. And yes, also there's Cleo. I mean, how many 80s cat characters can you name who wear leg warmers? Now, at the tail end of the 80s, we also had another set of cartoons that I'm a big fan of, which I like to call the Disney 3. Now, yes, Disney had been working in television going pretty far back into history, because Disney is pretty much the oldest surviving animation studio. But Disney had only ever really put in a token effort at TV animation before this. I mean, mostly this came in the form of longer specials and things. But in the mid-1980s, they actually started focusing a lot more on making full animated cartoon series. And a big reason for this is that during the early part of the 80s, Disney was actually not doing very well. Almost all of their movies that were coming out were turning into box office duds, and they were also having a lot of problems with their theme parks around this time, which is why they started refocusing on TV animation as a means of making a little bit more money. This started off the Disney Afternoon cartoons, which started originally with The Adventures of the Gummy Bears and The New Adventures of Winnie the Pooh, but would be followed very closely by DuckTales and Chip and Dale's Rescue Rangers. Now, firstly, I just want to highlight The Adventures of the Gummy Bears, because I think it's one of the most criminally underrated Disney properties that has seemingly just completely disappeared from people's memories. It was an excellently animated, really likable action-adventure show focusing on a family of bears living in the woods who have a magical potion that allows them to defeat ogres and stuff. It was such a great show with an original cast of characters that I'm honestly a bit puzzled how Gummy Bears completely missed out on the transition into the early 90s. I mean, I'm sure Gummy Bears was still in reruns, but for some reason it just never really managed to take off the same way as other Disney shows did. Case in point, DuckTales and Chip and Dale's Rescue Rangers. DuckTales was a cartoon focusing on Scrooge McDuck, a character who had been featured prominently in Donald Duck comics for nearly 3 decades at that point, but who had never really managed to make a really solid transition into animation. Now, the reason DuckTales was such a great cartoon because it took the great storytelling from the comics of Carl Barks and Don Rosa, 2 of the most iconic Scrooge McDuck artists, and coupled with it with great animation quality of shows from this period. Chip and Dale's Rescue Rangers, on the other hand, did something completely different. It took the well-established chipmunk characters of Chip and Dale from Disney's earlier cartoons and gave them a completely new cast of characters to interact with, the titular Rescue Rangers, who then went around saving animals and children and other people from the various bad guys on the show. Again, great production quality, and the great character dynamics of the Rescue Rangers is what really made this show one of my personal favorites. Though I will admit, I also kind of just have a soft spot for adventurous rodents. This is the reason why I've always liked the Rescuers and Secret of Nim as well. Yeah, I promised I wasn't going to talk about animated feature films that much here. Now, you will notice that I am really praising the animation quality of 80s cartoons, and that is one of the main things that definitely has stood the test of time the best. Like, don't get me wrong, the 80s was a time when cartoons also tried tipping their toes into handling very serious topics as well. But I get the feeling that it really took until the 1990s before these more serious and earnest storytelling methods became a lot more prevalent. Now, because I lived through the 90s, you can probably guess that I have a lot of favorites to highlight here, so I'll try to go through this list a little bit quicker, just so I don't get lost in the weeds. Now, one of the big design principles of the 1990s was gross-out comedy, but I was never really big into gross-out, and another important design change in the 90s was how more angular and stylized characters get. Now, in this case, I will say that the Hanna-Barbera set of cartoons in the mid to late 90s are actually ones that I do remember fairly fondly. These are shows like Dexter's Laboratory, Johnny Bravo, the Powerpuff Girls, and I did watch a fair bit of Cow and Chicken as well, but I was always a much bigger fan of I Am Weasel. I just think Weasel and Baboon were just much more relatable characters in a weird way. Now, these shows obviously used a lot of parody in them, and actually they still managed to have fairly compelling storytelling at times, despite being really over the top and silly as well. They really cranked up the crazy dial in cartoons around this time. Now, I've already mentioned a few of my Disney favorites. The last one that I actually kind of have a soft spot for is Goof Troop. The actual Goof Troop show is, again, mostly just a really well-animated comedy, and that's why I like it. But it did then, of course, lead to the excellent Goofy movies. which refocused on actual storytelling about Goofy and his son, with Goofy as a single parent with his son Max. But yeah, I do actually recommend watching original Goof Troop as well. It is just a great show overall. Now, Warner Brothers also had a really excellent run of cartoons during this time, especially thanks to their partnership with Steven Spielberg. This led to the creation of the Tiny Toons, which was a lean-on from the child character trend that started in the late 80s. But the Tiny Toons cartoons are legitimately just really good cartoons at times, so I highly recommend those. Then there was Animaniacs, although I was always a bigger fan of Pinky and the Brain, as were a lot of other people, which is why it was eventually turned into its own show. The comedic partnership between the main characters is basically the thing that sold the show. And I also really liked Freakazoid. Like I said, the 90s was a good time for superhero cartoons in general, which is why you started to see a lot of parodies of superhero cartoons. Now, I already mentioned TMNT during the 1980s, but I actually remember Turtles being just ridiculously popular even well into the 90s, which is why, even though the show started in the late 80s, I tend to always think of TMNT in the 90s, mostly because of, you know, the movies and video games and what have you. As a kid, I was also a huge fan of Captain Planet and the Planeteers, which I think is one of the better examples of educational cartoons, because it actually tried to treat the subject matter with a clear sense of earnestness. And it's also one of the last kind of holdover cartoons from the 80s in which the human characters actually still looked human. Like I said, stylized cartoons really started taking over during the 90s, and even the superhero shows got a lot more angular towards the end of the decade. And lastly, I kind of want to highlight this just for the hell of it, because I've been kind of avoiding the extreme side of 90s cartoons. I actually really liked Extreme Ghostbusters, which was supposed to be a follow-up on Dick's The Real Ghostbusters. And yes, I did watch The Real Ghostbusters growing up, but I'm always kind of put off by it these days, mostly because, you know, the main characters don't look like the movie versions of the characters. I mean, yeah, The Real Ghostbusters was a good cartoon, but seriously, this does not look like Harold Ramis. Now, if I talked about all of my 90s favorites, though, we would be here all day, so I'll just throw in a few other weirdos, because the 90s saw a lot of short-lived cartoons, and ones that never actually took off, except in very small areas. So there were also, like, super weirdos like The Pirates of Dark Water, a show by Hanna-Barbera that tried to have an ongoing storyline, which they never completed. And then Biker Mice from Mars, which in my home country of Finland actually became nearly as popular as the TMNT did. But because the show wasn't that popular anywhere else, it kind of faded into obscurity. But honestly, I highly recommend checking it out. It's actually a legitimately really good cartoon. Anyway, so that was part 2 of the eras of cartoons, where I talked about some of my favorites. So, what are some of your favorites from the various eras that I highlighted, and what overall is your favorite era of cartoons? For me, it's a bit of a weird toss-up between the cartoons of the 80s and the zany era of the 40s and 50s. It might be just because I grew up watching these shows quite a bit, and I have a real soft spot for the 80s aesthetic, but I kinda just enjoy the unabashed zaniness of the 40s and 50s cartoons as well. But that has been this video. I'm TheHande. See you on the next one.